The night was supposed to be a celebration. The overseers, those self-appointed lords of cruelty, had gathered at the big house and around the fields to mark the end of harvest. Barrels of rum cracked open. The sharp sound of fiddles and banjos filled the air. Laughter, loud and careless, echoed across the plantation grounds. For them, it was a night of triumph, another season of profit wrung from the sweat and suffering of enslaved men, women, and children. But for those who toiled in silence, those who bent their backs under the merciless sun, this night meant something else entirely. It was not a celebration. It was a reckoning. Hidden in the shadows beyond the bonfires, the enslaved gathered. They had been forced to dance, to clap, to sing when commanded, their joy serving as the evening's entertainment. Yet their eyes betrayed them. Their hands trembled not from exhaustion, but from anticipation. For months, they had watched, waited, and whispered. Tonight, the masquerade of obedience would end. And at the center of this storm to come was a figure no one would have expected, a child. A child, scarcely tall enough to reach the overseer's knees, carried the weight of centuries of pain in their small hands. Innocence stolen long ago, this child had grown up with chains for toys, with hunger as a companion, and with violence as a daily tutor. They had seen mothers beaten, fathers whipped, siblings sold away, and still been told to smile for the master. Tonight, the child would smile no more. The overseers, drunk on liquor and arrogance, believed themselves untouchable. They jeered at one another, boasting about yields, about how much cotton or sugar had been pulled from the earth at the crack of the whip. They laughed about discipline, about who had beaten the strongest man, who had broken the proudest spirit. Their voices rose in cruel celebration, completely blind to the silence that was slowly closing in around them. For in the shadows, fire flickered. Small brands, pulled from the bonfires meant for festivity, passed hand to hand. The enslaved whispered prayers under their breath, some to God, some to ancestors, some to the spirits of the land itself. Each brand glowed like an ember of rage, each one a symbol of defiance. The child was the one who signaled the moment. Perhaps it was with a glance. Perhaps it was with a word carried like lightning through the dark. Perhaps it was simply the sight of their small hand clutching a flame. Whatever it was, that was the spark that lit the night. Suddenly, silence broke into chaos. Flames leapt high into the air as dry barns and wooden structures caught fire in an instant. The smell of smoke mingled with the acrid stench of fear. Overseers scrambled, their laughter replaced by screams. The fiddle strings snapped as the musician fled, the notes drowned in the roar of the blaze. Some tried to run, but the paths were cut off. Firebrands hurled at doors, and windows trapped them inside. What had been their fortress became their coffin. Others tried to fight back, drawing pistols or clubs, but they were outnumbered, surrounded by those they had underestimated all their lives. And always, at the heart of it, the child moved, not leading with the command of an adult general, but with the fearlessness of someone who had nothing left to lose. In that moment, their small stature was their shield. No one saw the danger until it was too late. A child could slip where an adult could not, could strike when no one expected it, could ignite fires under the very noses of their oppressors. The night became a nightmare painted in red and orange. Flames consumed crops, wagons, and walls. The cries of overseers mingled with the chants of the enslaved, voices that had once been forced into silence now rising in thunder. Rage, centuries deep, was unleashed in a single night of blood and fire. And yet, this was not freedom. It was not the end of slavery. It was a glimpse, a flash, a brief and terrible eruption of what had been boiling beneath the surface for generations. The rebellion of one child and their community would not destroy the institution that bound them, but it would terrify those who profited from it. It would linger in whispers and warnings, a story told in hushed voices. Beware the slave child with the firebrand. By dawn, the plantation would be unrecognizable. Smoldering ruins where once there had been barns. Ash where once there had been harvest. Silence where once there had been laughter. But before we reach the morning, before we examine the consequences, we must step back. Who was this child? What kind of world forces someone so young to become a revolutionary, an arsonist, a leader of death? How could a place built on the facade of civilization produce such darkness in both oppressor and oppressed? This story is not simply about a massacre. It is about a system so cruel, so unnatural, that even children, the most innocent among us, were pushed into becoming agents of violence. To understand that night, we must first understand the world that made it possible. And so, before the ashes settle, before we look upon the wreckage, let us turn back. Let us peel away the illusions of festivity, the masks of joy, and descend into the grim reality of childhood under slavery. Because in that reality, we will find the origins of the fire. The child at the center of this massacre was born into a world where freedom was an impossibility. The world they knew was measured in chains, in whips, in the cold, relentless orders of overseers. Each day began before dawn, when the air was still thick with mist and the earth damp beneath bare feet. Tiny hands, barely strong enough to grasp a hoe or carry a basket, were pressed into labor from sunrise to sunset. The concept of childhood as we know it, laughter, play, learning, did not exist here. Play was a privilege reserved for the overseer's children, and learning was measured in obedience, not curiosity. Families were fragile, scattered by the whims of those who treated humans as property. Mothers could be sold to distant plantations, fathers punished for the smallest perceived disobedience, and siblings torn apart without warning. The child grew up learning early that attachment was dangerous. Love, if it existed, had to be quiet, hidden behind closed doors, whispered between the cracks of the cabin walls. And yet, even in such conditions, small sparks of human resilience survived. The child's eyes became instruments of survival. Watching, memorizing, calculating. Every glance could reveal danger or opportunity. The overseers underestimated them, seeing only a small, seemingly harmless body. But beneath that unassuming frame was a mind shaped by observation, by necessity. They learned the rhythms of fear, when the whip would strike, when the dogs would bark, when silence could save a life. And as the child grew, so too did the fire of indignation, kindled quietly behind the veil of compliance. It is difficult for us today to grasp the psychological weight of such a childhood. Imagine seeing violence not as a rare exception, but as a constant companion. Imagine knowing that your life, and the lives of everyone you loved, depended on the unpredictable whims of those who considered you less than human. For this child, rage and cunning became survival mechanisms. Empathy existed, but it was always paired with caution. Innocence was a memory stolen before it could bloom. The plantation itself was a microcosm of terror and control. Overseers patrolled the fields like predators, their shadows falling across rows of crops like a physical mark of ownership. The child had to memorize paths, escape routes, and hiding places. One misstep could mean a broken limb, a flogging, or worse. And yet, the child also learned the hidden networks of resistance. Whispers shared in kitchens, coded songs sung in the evenings, secret messages passed from one cabin to the next. Even in bondage, a quiet rebellion existed, the assertion of identity, a refusal to fully submit, a preparation for the inevitable moment when survival demanded audacity. The dichotomy of innocence and experience was never more stark than in play. While overseers' children ran freely through the fields, the enslaved child's play was ritualized, restrained, almost invisible. But even here, ingenuity shone. Small acts of defiance were hidden in mimicry, in games that seemed harmless but reinforced strength, strategy, and unity. Every whispered plan, every covert glance toward the master's tents, became a rehearsal for the night when the controlled chaos of the festival would explode into rebellion. Yet the child was not merely hardened by brutality. They were also shaped by the culture and spirituality of the enslaved community. Stories of ancestors who resisted, who fought back against chains, were told at night in low, urgent tones. Songs carried hidden messages about freedom, about hope, about vengeance. Even as the body labored under the sun, the mind absorbed lessons in resilience. These oral traditions were lifelines, a way to preserve humanity in a world determined to strip it away. It is easy to forget that children can bear tremendous weight when forced to grow up too quickly. In this case, childhood trauma and survival instincts fused into an extraordinary capacity for courage, cunning, and leadership. The child did not simply inherit anger from oppression. They internalized it, learned to channel it with precision, and awaited the moment when it could be unleashed. To those who watched them, the child appeared small, fragile, almost invisible. But invisibility was power. Underestimation was an advantage that would soon become deadly. By the time the harvest festival arrived, this child had already lived a lifetime in the shadow of cruelty. Every step in the fields, every act of feigned obedience, every whispered lesson from elders had prepared them for a single, pivotal night. The fire they carried would be both literal and metaphorical, a manifestation of years of suffering, injustice, and silent planning. This was not the impulsive act of a child, but the calculated eruption of a mind forced into maturity far too early and into leadership far too soon. Understanding this childhood is crucial to understanding the massacre that would follow. It was a childhood shaped by chains, yet also by cunning, by fear, yet also by resilience. The child's small hands could wield firebrands because their mind had been tempered in the forge of oppression. Their leadership was born not of choice, but of necessity. And so, before we delve into the harvest festival itself, before the first ember leaps into the night sky, we must carry with us the full weight of this childhood, a childhood of terror, ingenuity, and unspoken rage. Only then can we comprehend the scale of what was about to unfold, and the courage it took for a child to turn the tools of oppression into instruments of vengeance. The massacre was coming, but it was first nurtured in the shadows of childhood, in the silent resilience, the calculated observation, and the simmering fire of a child who would not be broken. The harvest festival was supposed to be a night of laughter, music, and temporary reprieve. Overseers called it a celebration, a reward for themselves, and, superficially, for the laborers who had toiled all season. It was, in reality, a stage, a carefully constructed illusion. Every drumbeat, every clap, every forced smile and exaggerated bow was meant to reinforce the hierarchy. The enslavers feasted, the enslaved performed, and the boundaries of power remained unchallenged. But beneath the layers of celebration, the festival carried dual meaning. To the overseers, it was indulgence. To the enslaved, it was opportunity. There was a rhythm to the night, one that few outsiders ever understood. Music, singing, and dancing were never simply for pleasure. They were a language, a code, a map of human resilience. The fiddler high-pitched tunes, the drum's steady thump, and the shuffling of bare feet were instruments of subtle communication. The enslaved watched one another closely, signaling danger, plotting small acts of defiance, and reinforcing solidarity. The festival began innocuously. Bonfires flared in courtyards, casting long, flickering shadows over the plantation. Tables groaned with the food of the wealthy, roasted meats, pies sweetened with sugar from the very fields the enslaved had harvested, and barrels of rum that the overseers consumed with shameless gluttony. They laughed at their own jokes, boasting about their dominion and mocking those forced to entertain them. Children of the masters ran freely, while the enslaved children mimicked their movements from the margins, learning the dance steps, but also the subtleties of timing, observation, and stealth. Yet it was in those margins that the seeds of rebellion took root. The enslaved were permitted this night only under surveillance, but that surveillance was uneven. Overseers, drunk on their own power and rum, grew careless. Some wandered too far from the bonfires. Others were too absorbed in games of gambling and boasting. In the corners of the plantation, hidden behind fences and carts, whispers traveled. Eyes met, hands brushed. Plans were rehearsed in silence, as natural as breathing, yet as dangerous as stepping into a lion's den. The festival, like a mask, hid both terror and defiance. Masks were literal for some, worn in dances or plays to amuse the overseers. But for the enslaved, the mask was metaphorical, a performance of obedience, laughter, and humility while inwardly harboring rage, fear, and cunning. Every movement, every song, every seemingly obedient step was measured, deliberate. The child, already shaped by years of hardship and observation, navigated this masquerade with precision. Small hands that once labored in fields now carried the promise of fire. Small eyes that once flinched at every bark of a whip now scanned the grounds like a strategist surveying a battlefield. And yet, the festival was not solely a rehearsal for rebellion. It was also a testament to resilience. The enslaved took these few hours to reclaim fragments of humanity stolen from them. Music became a lifeline, rhythm a shield. Jokes were whispered, stories shared, laughter exchanged in secret. Even as the overseers indulged themselves in grotesque excess, the enslaved community asserted, in subtle ways, that their spirits had not been fully broken. Every glance, every hidden smile, was a quiet reminder that the night's oppressive hierarchy was not absolute. It was during this festival that the child first understood the full weight of opportunity. The overseer's carelessness, combined with the revelry and chaos of the night, created a moment that was both rare and terrifying. Small doors were left unlatched. Fire from the bonfires flickered close to barns and storage sheds. Weapons were stacked carelessly in corners. The plantation, for all its cruelty, was now vulnerable. Every shadow became a potential ally, every overlooked oversight a weapon. The child and their fellow conspirators had observed these patterns for months. They understood timing, sequence, and the psychology of the overseers. The drunk and arrogant could be provoked. The careless could be manipulated. The distracted could be trapped. It was an orchestration, a careful dance in which death and fire were partners, and the unsuspecting overseers were the prey. This festival, meant to assert dominance and celebrate a brutal system, had ironically created the conditions for its own undoing. The very indulgence that showcased the overseer's power also revealed their weaknesses, and the child, armed with nothing more than courage, cunning, and a small hand clutching a firebrand, became the fulcrum on which the revolt would pivot. As night deepened, the sounds of laughter, music, and feasting reached a crescendo. The smell of roasted meat mingled with the earthy scent of fields and smoke from the bonfires. Everyone moved according to the rhythm of the festival, unaware of the invisible threads being pulled behind the scenes. The enslaved waited, poised like coiled springs, and the child prepared to strike. The stage was set, the players unaware that the night's performance would end in flames and terror. It was not merely the child's courage that defined the coming events, but the collective patience, planning, and silent communication of the enslaved. Every glance, every hidden movement, every whispered instruction had been rehearsed for months. This was not chaos, it was strategy. And in that strategy lay the brilliance of what was about to unfold. A massacre that would shock the overseers and leave the world forever questioning how a child could wield such destructive power. By the time the first ember was lit, the festival had transformed from a masquerade of control into a stage for revolt. The masks of celebration had fallen away, replaced by the flickering light of flames, the sudden terror of those who had underestimated the powerless, and the eerie calm of a child poised to change history in a single, fiery night. The Harvest Festival, meant to showcase joy and control, had become the perfect trap, and at its heart was a child who had learned everything from the shadows. A child whose small hands carried the culmination of years of suffering, cunning, and unspoken rage. Rebellion does not ignite in an instant. It simmers quietly, often unnoticed, long before the first act of violence. In the case of the Harvest Festival massacre, the spark was not spontaneous. It had been nurtured in secret, rehearsed in whispers, and carried in the hearts of the oppressed for months. The child, small and seemingly powerless, had become both observer and orchestrator, learning to navigate the complex network of fear, loyalty, and strategy that existed among the enslaved community. Planning such an audacious revolt was fraught with danger. A single misstep could mean immediate death, not only for the child, but for everyone involved. Overseers were vigilant, constantly watching, their suspicions sharpened by the knowledge that enslaved people had resisted before. Yet overconfidence worked in favor of the oppressed. The overseers did not see the signs, nor could they imagine that a child, so unassuming, so innocent, could become the fulcrum of destruction. The conspirators had learned to exploit the patterns of their oppressors. They observed the drunken stagger of overseers, the moments when doors were left unlocked, the routines of guards, and the rotation of patrols. Every detail mattered. The weight of a barn door, the flammability of haystacks, the timing of lantern lighting, the intervals at which overseers checked the fields. The child memorized these rhythms as if they were a map, a guide to turning the festival of control into a theater of chaos. Communication was subtle. Notes could not be written. Whispered words were risky. The child relied on gestures, glances, and rehearsed signals, a language of survival passed down from elders, perfected over years of oppression. Even a slight hesitation could betray a plan. Every conspirator had to trust one another implicitly, knowing that a single betrayal could annihilate the entire network. Fire was the chosen instrument, symbolic as much as practical. Firebrands, stolen from the bonfires of celebration, became tools of both rebellion and revenge. To the child, fire was not just light, it was agency, the power to disrupt, destroy, and finally assert control over a system that had stripped them of autonomy since birth. The plan required precision. One ember could spread, but one miscalculation could also end in disaster. The child's small hands, previously used for labor and survival, were now weaponized, carrying the literal spark of vengeance. The conspirators studied the overseer's psychology. Drunken arrogance often bred carelessness, and arrogance often bred overconfidence. The child observed this, noting when insults could provoke a reaction, when fear could be exploited, when hesitation could be leveraged. The strategy was meticulous. They would strike when the overseers were distracted, when celebration had lulled them into false security. Timing was everything. One moment too early, and the plan would fail. One moment too late, and death would be unavoidable. Trust, however, was fragile. Within the enslaved community, fear could fracture unity. Some were hesitant, torn between the desire for freedom and the instinct for survival. Convincing them required more than words. It required a quiet authority, a presence that inspired courage despite overwhelming odds. The child, despite their age, commanded this authority not through fear, but through determination. They had witnessed too much pain, endured too many losses, and carried the collective rage of generations. That rage became leadership. The night of the festival became the focus of endless rehearsal. Each conspirator memorized their role: who would block doors, who would carry weapons, who would create diversions. The child's role, central yet underestimated, was to ignite the flames, both figurative and literal, and to ensure the plan unfolded with precision. In every whispered meeting behind barns, in every cautious glance toward the overseer's tents, the child's mind mapped out contingencies, escape routes, and signals. This was not the impulsive act of rage. It was the calculated move of a strategist who had learned survival in the crucible of cruelty. There was a psychological dimension, too. The enslaved understood that fear could be weaponized as much as fire. The overseer's laughter, once a sign of power, would become their undoing. Panic spreads faster than logic, and chaos could amplify the smallest spark into complete collapse. The child, small and nimble, would move unseen through this chaos, guiding others and striking where opportunity demanded. Every movement was rehearsed, every gesture had meaning. Even as the plan matured, the child remained painfully aware of the stakes. Death was certain if discovery occurred. Retaliation would be merciless. Families could be punished collectively. And yet, the necessity of action outweighed fear. The child carried within them the knowledge that remaining silent, continuing to endure, was itself a slow death. To act, or to ignite the fire, was to claim agency, however fleeting, in a world designed to deny it. By the time the first flames would be unleashed, months of observation, whispered strategy, and careful planning had converged. The child's role, underestimated by everyone around them, would turn the overseer's world upside down. What the adults could not perceive, a child could exploit. The combination of innocence and cunning, small stature and audacity, fearlessness born of necessity. This was not merely rebellion. It was poetic in its cruelty, a mirror held up to a society that had relied on oppression for centuries. The overseers, blind in their indulgence, would see their world unravel before their eyes, struck down by those they deemed powerless. And at the heart of it all, a child would wield fire as both weapon and symbol, a spark of vengeance born from years of darkness and suffering. The spark had been prepared. The stage had been set. All that remained was the moment when careful planning would collide with the chaos of action, and the harvest festival would be transformed from a night of false celebration into a night of fire, terror, and unforgettable history. The night had arrived. The harvest festival, once a facade of laughter and indulgence, had transformed into a stage for destruction. The overseers, drunk on rum and arrogance, had not noticed the silent figures moving through shadows, nor the careful glances and whispered signals among the enslaved. They believed themselves untouchable, masters of the night and of life itself. But as the first ember leapt from a firebrand, reality shattered. The child moved swiftly, almost unseen, hands steady despite the weight of the moment. Firebrands, stolen from the ceremonial bonfires, ignited haystacks and wooden carts. Flames flickered like living shadows, consuming structures that symbolized wealth and oppression. Panic erupted among the overseers. Laughter gave way to screams. Their arrogance, once unshakable, crumbled under the sudden terror. Chaos spread faster than any plan could dictate. Doors slammed, windows shattered, and smoke poured into the night sky, swallowing the sounds of the festival in a choking haze. The enslaved, previously hidden in the margins, now emerged with purpose. They moved with precision, guided by months of observation, rehearsed signals, and a single, unifying goal: survival and retribution. The child led them, not with fear, but with a clarity born of desperation and years of injustice. The scene was apocalyptic. Flames licked the edges of the great hall where the overseers had feasted, turning their opulence into fuel. The crackle of fire mixed with shouts and the sharp, sudden cracks of musket shots fired in panic. Those who tried to flee found themselves cornered, trapped by strategically placed obstacles and barricades. Every action the overseers had taken to assert control now became a liability. Their own structures and routines, meant to protect them, transformed into a labyrinth of doom. The child, barely visible in the flickering light, moved like a phantom among the chaos. Small stature, once considered a weakness, allowed them to slip through cracks, duck beneath doors, and strike where none would expect. Firebrands in hand, the child ignited the tinder of vengeance, both literal and symbolic. Each spark became a sentence, each flame a declaration. The powerless were not so powerless tonight. Blood mingled with smoke. Panic twisted into violence. Overseers attempted to rally, to strike back, but their coordination faltered in the face of both fire and fear. The enslaved struck with precision, targeting key positions, cutting off escape routes, and exploiting confusion. The night was no longer a festival. It was a battlefield, a theater of rage that had been waiting for its moment for years, decades even. Yet the child's actions were more than just tactical brilliance. They were a statement. Each deliberate movement, each firebrand hurled, was the embodiment of every injustice witnessed and endured. Mothers beaten, fathers whipped, siblings sold, and nights spent in terror, all coalesced in this single, harrowing moment. For the child, the fire was justice, the chaos was expression, and the massacre was both rebellion and catharsis. Time lost meaning in the frenzy. Smoke obscured vision. Flames danced over walls, hay, and wooden floors, consuming everything indiscriminately. The overseers, once so confident, became terrified animals, stumbling blindly through the growing inferno. Their cries echoed across the fields, horrifying in their desperation, yet a grim testament to the power that the enslaved had finally seized, however fleetingly. Some tried to resist. Pistols were raised, clubs swung, but in the darkness and confusion, resistance was ineffective. The enslaved moved as a single organism, guided by the child's vision. Each act was calculated, precise, almost surgical. No mercy was expected, none was given. This was a revolt born of years of abuse, of lives devalued, of children forced to grow in shadows. Justice, cruel and raw, found its form in fire and fury. The night carried an almost mythical quality. Flames painted faces in terrifying light, casting long, flickering shadows. Smoke twisted like spirits of the past, ancestors watching through the haze. The child's small figure moved with purpose and fearlessness, guiding the firebrands, signaling the group, coordinating chaos. It was a moment where innocence and terror coexisted, a child wielding destruction with the precision of one hardened by necessity. Yet even in the midst of triumph, the weight of the night pressed down. Death was everywhere, and survival demanded ruthlessness. There was no room for hesitation, no time for doubt. Every choice had consequences. Every movement was life or death. The child, in a way that only a survivor shaped by trauma could, moved with cold clarity, balancing courage and instinct against the enormity of what they had unleashed. By the time dawn approached, the plantation was unrecognizable. Fires burned low, leaving only smoldering ruins where once there had been barns, feasting halls, and the symbols of authority. Smoke hung thick over the fields, a ghostly shroud over the aftermath of what had transpired. The overseers who survived were either fled or defeated. Their world had been overturned in hours. The child, small and almost invisible, had led a massacre that would echo far beyond the night, terrifying those who profited from oppression and inspiring the oppressed, if only in whispered legend. This was not just rebellion. It was an eruption of human emotion and ingenuity, a violent assertion of agency in a world designed to strip it away. The child's role, underestimated by all who had known them, became a testament to the extremes of resilience, courage, and cunning. In the flames of the harvest festival, the scales of power were briefly balanced, and the child, once powerless, once invisible, became the axis around which terror and justice revolved. And yet, even in the aftermath, there was no full victory. The fires would burn out, the overseer's authority would return, and the enslaved would face the consequences of their rebellion. But the night itself, the inferno, the act of defiance, would live on, a stark, unforgettable reminder that even the smallest, most underestimated among us can ignite change when pushed to the edge. The massacre was complete. The child had acted. Fire had claimed its due. The world of the plantation, for one night, belonged to those it had sought to enslave. And in that brief, terrifying moment, history had been rewritten, one ember at a time. By dawn, the fires that had consumed the plantation burned low, leaving behind charred remnants of barns, shattered feast halls, and the smoking skeletons of wooden fences. The night's violence had left the land irrevocably altered, both physically and psychologically. For the overseers, the taste of terror lingered like ash in the mouth. Their laughter and arrogance of the previous evening had been replaced by horror and disbelief. The carefully constructed illusion of control had been obliterated by a child and a community that had been underestimated for far too long. But terror was only the beginning. Retribution arrived swiftly and mercilessly. Word of the revolt spread to neighboring plantations, and soon armed militias, slave catchers, and panicked overseers descended upon the site. The enslaved who had survived the massacre were rounded up, interrogated, tortured, and executed. Families were broken apart further, and entire communities were punished for the actions of a few. The child, central to the revolt, faced the unimaginable weight of responsibility not just for their actions, but for the collective punishment exacted upon those they led. The cruelty of retribution was calculated to instill fear. Survivors were forced to watch the executions of comrades. Houses were burned in reprisal. Fields were stripped and destroyed to remind everyone of the consequences of resistance. The overseer's goal was clear: to demonstrate that rebellion, no matter how courageous or justified, would never be tolerated. The child and the conspirators had ignited a fire of vengeance, but the response was firestorm-level brutality designed to snuff out not only rebellion but hope itself. Historical records, often written by those who benefited from slavery, downplayed the revolt, sanitizing the event to obscure the humanity and agency of the enslaved. The child's role was often reduced to rumor or myth, erased from official accounts, and the revolt reframed as an uncontrollable riot rather than a carefully planned act of resistance. Yet in private, whispered conversations, and oral histories, the story endured. Survivors spoke of the child's bravery, of the strategy, and of the night when the powerless had overturned the world of their oppressors, if only for a fleeting moment. The psychological toll on the enslaved community was immense. Losses were profound, not just in lives, but in trust, family, and sanctuary. Children who had participated or witnessed the massacre carried scars both seen and unseen. Yet even amidst grief, a sense of resilience persisted. The memory of the revolt, of the night when the weak became dangerous, became a cornerstone of communal identity. The fire, though extinguished, burned on in memory, a symbol of defiance that no militia could fully erase. The overseers themselves were shaken. Even as they attempted to reassert authority, the fear lingered. One child had reminded them of the fragility of their control. No longer could they view the enslaved as entirely powerless, and the lingering question haunted their households. Who else could be underestimated? The psychological imbalance created by a single act of defiance altered the dynamics of oppression, at least temporarily, leaving behind a legacy of fear and caution. The child's fate, like that of many young insurgents, remains shrouded in uncertainty. Some accounts suggest they were captured and executed swiftly, a brutal end meant to serve as an example. Others suggest the child vanished into the forests, protected by the network of the enslaved community. In either case, their actions left a mark far beyond the physical destruction. The child's courage had carved a story into history, one that challenged the assumptions of power and reminded all who lived under oppression that even the smallest could wield immense influence. Ashes on the ground were not the only remnants of that night. The story of rebellion traveled beyond the plantation. It spread through oral histories, through whispered songs, and through the memories of those who survived. In places where literacy was denied, memory became resistance. The revolt became a warning, a lesson, and a beacon, a demonstration that courage and ingenuity could temporarily overturn an oppressive system. Yet the tragedy of retribution is impossible to ignore. The massacre's success was ephemeral, and the consequences were devastating. Death, separation, and suffering followed in waves. Every act of resistance carried with it the shadow of reprisal, a cruel calculus the enslaved had always known. This tension between courage and consequence underscores the stark realities of life under slavery. Every victory came at immense risk, and every defiance exacted a devastating price. Still, the night's impact could not be erased. The child's leadership, the strategy, and the courage displayed remained etched into the collective consciousness of those who survived. For historians, the revolt serves as a testament to the extremes of human resilience and the lengths to which people will go to reclaim agency. For descendants, it is a reminder of both the horrors endured and the courage exhibited by those who lived in unimaginable conditions. The aftermath of the massacre demonstrates a paradox inherent to resistance under oppression. The same fire that delivers justice can also ignite suffering. The night of terror and retribution, of flames and blood, left scars that would linger across generations. Yet it also forged a legacy of courage, a story that could not be fully silenced. The child's actions, the revolt itself, became symbols of defiance that endured beyond the immediate violence, echoing as a challenge to the structures of oppression and a testament to the enduring human spirit. The night of fire and blood had ended, but its consequences would reverberate for years, perhaps centuries. It was a moment when fear and courage collided, when a child and a community dared to defy the impossible, and when the limits of control were violently tested. The ashes may have settled, but the story lived on, a story of loss, vengeance, terror, and courage, a story that history could not fully erase. The flames of the harvest festival may have burned out, but the story of that night refused to die. The child who led the revolt, whether captured, vanished, or remembered only in whispers, became a symbol that transcended time. In the aftermath of fire and blood, the plantation returned to a grim routine, overseers attempting to reassert dominance, and the enslaved enduring punishment and grief. Yet in the hearts of those who survived, and in the memories passed down through generations, the night lived on as a beacon of resistance, a reminder that even the smallest, most underestimated among us could wield unimaginable power when pushed to the edge. History, however, has a cruel tendency to erase those who defy the rules of the powerful. Official records often referred to the revolt as a riot or insurrection, minimizing its strategic brilliance and the agency of the enslaved. The child's name, like so many others, was omitted or reduced to rumor, a shadow in the margins of documents written by those who sought to justify slavery. And yet, within the oral traditions of enslaved communities, the story persisted. Songs carried coded recollections of that night. Stories, whispered from parent to child, preserved the courage and cunning of the revolt, transforming it into a living memory that no historian could fully erase. The legacy of the massacre is complex. On one hand, it was a story of horrifying violence and inevitable tragedy. The retribution that followed claimed countless lives, shattered families, and left deep psychological scars. The child who led the revolt was, in the eyes of the oppressors, a criminal whose audacity demanded punishment. On the other hand, the act was an extraordinary assertion of humanity in a world designed to strip it away. It was a declaration that the enslaved were not powerless, that agency could be reclaimed even in the face of seemingly insurmountable oppression. The child's leadership challenges our understanding of courage, strategy, and resilience. To orchestrate a revolt as a child requires not only intelligence, but the accumulation of profound psychological strength. The horrors endured in a lifetime compressed into mere years cultivated a mind capable of calculating risk, inspiring trust, and exploiting opportunity. This child, forced into an adult role by circumstance, became a figure whose story defies conventional narratives of both childhood and rebellion. Their audacity reminds us that courage does not conform to age or size. It emerges from necessity, from a refusal to remain invisible, from a will to survive and strike back. Yet the child's story is also a warning. It highlights the devastating consequences of a system built on cruelty. Every act of resistance in such a world comes with unbearable risk. Families were destroyed, communities traumatized, and the enslaved forced to live under the shadow of retaliation. The massacre did not topple slavery, it could not. But it did illuminate the cracks in the facade of control, showing that fear and cruelty could never fully erase human ingenuity and courage. In the centuries that followed, historians and storytellers have grappled with the meaning of the revolt. Some view it as a moment of tragic futility, emphasizing the suffering it provoked. Others interpret it as a testament to human resilience, a rare and extraordinary instance of rebellion against an unyielding system. The child's actions, preserved in memory rather than official records, resonate as a reminder that history is often written by the victors, but the truth of courage and defiance can endure in less tangible ways, through songs, oral histories, and the persistent recollection of the oppressed. There is a haunting beauty in the duality of this story. Fire destroyed barns, feast halls, and fields, but it also ignited a lasting spark of inspiration. Death and destruction were immediate, visible, and horrifying. Yet the child's audacity, the precision of the revolt, and the unity of the enslaved created a symbolic victory that could never be fully erased. It is in this duality, the horror and the hope, the tragedy and the triumph, that the story resonates most powerfully. Even today, the memory of the revolt offers lessons about the complexities of oppression and resistance. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, that childhood can be stolen, that systems of power depend on fear, and that acts of defiance, even when costly, leave indelible marks on history. The child who led the revolt embodies both the potential for extraordinary courage and the heavy toll of systemic cruelty. Their story lingers not only as an account of violence, but as a meditation on resilience, morality, and the lengths to which humans will go to reclaim dignity in an unjust world. Ultimately, the Harvest Festival Massacre is more than a historical event. It is a mirror reflecting the extremes of human experience. It shows the depths of cruelty that can be inflicted upon the innocent, the ingenuity and bravery that emerge under oppression, and the paradoxical consequences of challenging entrenched power. The child who wielded the firebrand is remembered as both avenger and victim, strategist and symbol. In the ashes of the plantation, their legacy endures, a fire that cannot be fully extinguished, a story that continues to ignite reflection, empathy, and haunting wonder. The night of fire and blood, with all its horror, tragedy, and fleeting triumph, remains a testament to the human spirit. It reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, courage can ignite change, that resilience can survive brutality, and that the most underestimated among us can leave a mark that transcends time. The child's story endures not only in history, but in memory and imagination, a legacy of fire that refuses to fade.